Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar. We can see that a few more people are still coming in, so we'll make a start in just a couple of minutes. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I wanted to start off just by introducing myself. My name's Amanda Wolfe. I'm a Senior Marketing Manager at Macmillan International Higher Education, and I'll be managing today's webinar. Before we get started, there are a few points of housekeeping. Via the webinar software, you will be automatically muted. This is because we'll be recording today's session, and so we want to ensure that there isn't any background noise which might affect the recording. That said, please feel free to ask any questions via the panel in the sidebar. We'll be monitoring this and we'll come to any questions both during and also at the end of today's session. As mentioned, we'll be recording the session. We'll automatically send you a copy of the recording so that should you like to share it with any students or any friends or colleagues, please feel free to do that. Okay, so time to make a start. I'll now hand over to the host of our webinar.
Hello, good afternoon from Maastricht. I'm Hugo Dijkstra. I'm delighted that you're joining our webinar today. These are strange times for all of us. A lot of university lecturers trying to move education online. A lot of students being scattered all over the world. And what we were thinking was to organize a number of webinars. This is the first one of them, to actually talk about international organizations and to give you some additional resources, additional support in these difficult times. So I'm Hugo Dijkstra, I'm from Maastricht University, and I'm one of the co-authors of this textbook on international organizations. You may be familiar with the book or not, that really doesn't matter. We're going to be talking simply about the theory and history of international organizations today. I will be using the book as a background, but this is really an introductory session to the topic. Indeed, if you have any questions, please ask them during the webinar via the chat box. We take some time from during the different sessions of the webinar in order to answer your questions. So if you want to go deeper into the substance, if you want to comment on the slides and the things that I'm telling you, please don't hesitate. So let me just now go, if this works, to the agenda of the webinar. I should have the next slide. Yes. So this is the agenda of today. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is I'm going to give an introduction to international organizations. I'm going to be talking about the theories of international organization and the history of international organization. These are essentially the first 3 chapters of the book on international organization that I co-authored. And during the other webinars, and I'll get towards that towards the end of this session, we're going to be talking about policy making in international organizations, the activities of international organizations, as well as essentially the future of international organizations. But for today, we focus on the first 3 chapters, what are international organizations, the theories, and the history. So let's get started. what are international organizations? And I think here we have to start with a number of definitions. Obviously, there are many ways to define international organizations, but one way that I found particularly helpful is introduced by John Peevaus and his colleagues, and it includes 3 elements. International organizations have 3 or more member states. They organize a plenary meeting every 10 years or so, and they have a secretariat and a correspondence address. Now, these are very much minimum criteria for international organizations. After all, some international organizations have universal membership. The United Nations has 193 member states, so a lot more than 3. They have 193. A lot of international organizations also organize meetings every single day. Think about the European Union, where ministers walk through Brussels on a daily basis. And while an international organization needs to have a secretariat, occasionally consisting of 3, 4, 5 staff members, some international organizations have massive secretariats. Think about the European Commission of tens of thousands of EU civil servants working for the EU, but also the United Nations or the International Monetary Fund have very large staff and secretariats. So these are very much minimum criteria to define international organizations. And if we add it all up, we come to about 534 international organizations that have been created since the Treaty of Vienna in 1815. So 500 international organizations, give or take. So really quite a large number. Now, not all these international organizations are alive anymore. Currently, there are about 340 still alive. And over time, in the last 2 centuries, about 200 international organizations have failed. They have died. Member states have dissolved international organizations. They may have replaced them, or international organizations have been integrated. A nice example, for instance, is the Organization for African Unity, which got replaced by the African Union, or Schengen. Schengen used to be an international organization and has now been integrated into the EU, the borderless travel. So even though there have been 500 plus international organizations created since the beginning of the 19th century, not all of them exist anymore. And I've included this nice graph here as well on the slide. And you can see that there are essentially 3 different periods we can distinguish. There's a period from the beginning of the 19th century up until the Second World War, where international organizations got slowly created. Then we see a tremendous increase in international organizations after the Second World War, and we see thirdly a stabilization since the mid-1990s. Now, it doesn't mean that international organizations are no longer created, but these days, international organizations often fail. They get dissolved, they get replaced, they get integrated at the same rate as they are being created. So 3 different phases of international organizations that can be defined as 3 or more member states, a plenary meeting every 10 years, and a secretariat. Now, in the rest of this webinar, we'll be zooming in on these different periods and also try to make sense of it. So let me go now to the next slide. Yes, because I think what's important as well is even though we have 530 international organizations, they're not all the same. And comparing international organizations is occasionally like comparing apples and oranges. Now in the book, we offer a whole range of different typologies, ways of organizing these 500 international organizations in different categories. But one of them I think is particularly important. And that is to distinguish international organizations between those that are task specific, that have one specific task or 2 specific tasks to do, and those that we call general purpose organizations that have many issues on the agenda. Now, let me give you a few examples. The European Union essentially deals with everything in Europe. So it has many issues, from trade to foreign policy to security policy, and currently even health policy with the coronavirus breaking out. Other international organizations, however, deal with less issues. The World Trade Organization obviously deals with trade. The International Monetary Fund deals with finance. So this is a useful way of making sense of the differences within those 500 organizations. Now, it's not just about the scope of these organizations that important. What we also see, for instance, is that a lot of task-specific organizations have a large membership. For instance, the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, they almost have universal membership, almost 200 member states. On the other hand, general purpose organizations are often region-specific. For instance, the African Union or the European Union have a limited membership related to Europe and Africa, and the same goes for many other regional organizations. So it's important to keep in mind that although we have 500 plus international organizations around the globe, they are very different in their design and orientation, and it's useful to distinguish them in different categories to better understand what they're actually doing. So I think at this moment, I'm just going to pause for a few seconds before moving on to the next topic on the agenda, which is the theories of international organizations. I mean, if there are any questions at this point, please feel free to put them in the chat box and ask them. If not, I'm going to be moving on to the theory of international organizations, and please feel free to also raise your questions at a later stage. We can always go back to earlier slides, so really don't worry at all. So let's talk a bit about the theory of international organizations. The first question really is, why do we need theories? Why talk about theories at all? And I think for me, the starting point is here, we have 500 international organizations, and they all have different sorts of member states, and there are all sorts of different actors, the people working in the secretariats, lobbyists, non-governmental organizations. And all these international organizations, they have different rules, they have different constitutions, they have different institutions. So there's a tremendous complexity when it comes to international organizations. Really, it is very difficult for anybody to understand what's going on in all these different organizations. Even for the EU or for NATO, for the United Nations, you probably have to work in these organizations for decades to really understand the day-to-day and what's going on. And that's why we're introducing theories. So what we try to do with theories is to explain patterns within international organizations, but also patterns across international organizations. Why is one international organization more effective than the other? Why in some international organizations does the United States play a key role? For instance, the World Bank, whereas in the United Nations General Assembly, the US has a smaller role. So these are the type of questions that we ask ourselves. And I think these are very important as well in the real world. I mean, what can, for instance, regional organizations learn from the European integration process? So the idea of theory is to try to make sense of all the complexity that there is out there, because it's simply impossible for us to describe all these 500 organizations, all their actors and all their institutions. Now, like in the field of international relations, there are essentially three big schools of theory that help us explain international organizations. And we group them under the realist school, the institutionalist school, and the constructivist school. So from now onwards, I have a slide each for every school, and I try to give you a bit of a sense of how these theories think about international organizations and their differences. So let's start with realism, which is obviously one of the starting theories, a benchmark theory that we like to compare other theories to. Now, realism, as you probably know, stresses very much power politics at the heart of international relations. As a matter of fact, realists don't think that international organizations matter that much in international relations. And yet, if we think through realism and power politics, there are ways that we can see how international organizations are working. And I think the first thing is that for realists, international organizations are very much forums where great power politics is played out. I've included here a picture of the UN Security Council. It's essentially a forum where all the powerful states of the world come together and talk diplomatically about their differences. It's a meeting place for questions of peace and security. And you can think of a lot of international organizations along these terms. It's simply for great powers very useful to have these forums where they can meet and talk to each other. Now, a second point that realists make is that international organizations very much favor the strong. So the design of international organizations mirrors great power politics. And once again, here you can see the UN Security Council. I mean, as you all know, in the UN Security Council, there are 5 powerful member states that have a permanent seat and have veto: the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom. So the design of the Security Council, the design of this forum actually favors those type of states, the winners essentially of the Second World War. And as a result, the output of international organizations is also biased to the interest of the great powers. If the United States or China doesn't like a resolution of the UN Security Council, it can veto it. So by extension, what comes out of the UN Security Council is likely biased towards these interests of the 5 permanent members. So that's really how realists look at it. International organizations as such are not actors in international relations, but they're useful forums, and those forums reflect the interest of the great powers. So that's one theory of international organization. It's what we call the realist school. Let me just move on now to the second theory of international organizations, which is the Institutionalist School. Just one slide back, there we go, the Institutionalist School. Now, institutionalism is different. It says that because of institutionalist cooperation through international organizations, we're getting different outcomes. I've put 2 pictures here of the Secretary General of the UN shaking hands with Donald Trump, shaking hands with Putin, and the idea of institutionalism is really because there are players such as the UN Secretary General, cooperation takes different turns. After all, international organizations foster thick cooperation. They provide reliable information and reduce uncertainty among states. They're permanent and continuous forms of cooperation. It's not as if the great powers meet once and then go back home. No, they meet every single day in large international organizations. They're also expert bureaucrats who know a thing or two about international cooperation. Think of all these experts in the World Health Organization these days. They provide expertise to many countries on how to deal with the coronavirus. And often these international experts are also in charge of policy implementation. Furthermore, within international organizations, there are often options to mediate or adjudicate conflicts. The International Court of Justice, for instance, is the place where member states can go to settle their conflicts. You can also think about the International Monetary Fund. If countries run out of funding, they can go to the International Monetary Fund. So the argument here of institutionalists is what we see in international organizations is particularly thick cooperation. It's not one-off, it's not just one time, it's permanent and it's continuous. And that essentially shapes how states adopt outcomes in international politics. Now, what institutionalists have very much done is not just talk about the reasons why international cooperation is different. And what they've also done is to look at different types of institutions that are around. And one example here is the focus on institutional design. So a group of scholars have looked at, why do international institutions look different? Why do some have a small membership where others have a large membership? Why do some have a small policy scope where others have a large policy scope? Why are some centralized and others decentralized? So a lot of the emphasis in institutionalism has gone to trying to explain differences in international organizations, the way they have been set up, the way they look, the way they act. So I think that has been really a major contribution of institutionalism, not just explaining how international organizations create further cooperation, but also how institutions look. Now, let me then finally move on to the third theory of international organization, the Constructivist School, which takes an even further step. Constructivists say that international organizations actually transform cooperation. And I've included here a picture of a statue of a gun that's placed in front of the United Nations in New York, the building there, which actually gives you a sense of transforming the type of violence that a gun represents into something else. And I think this is really the type of argument that we know from constructivists. They say, yeah, okay, states have all sorts of interests, but ultimately they also act through the logic of appropriateness. They do what people think is appropriate of them. And in this sense, culture and historical experience shape the behavior of actors. They abide by international norms. And a very good example here is the norm against chemical weapons. As a result of the First World War, where chemical weapons were used really quite a lot, states witnessed those horrors of the war and the use of chemical weapons. And over time, they adopted a norm which simply says that in war you can't use chemical weapons. And you might remember that when Syria actually used chemical weapons against its own citizens, the whole world community got upset, adopted Security Council resolutions, and as a result moved chemical weapons out of Syria. So even though war still takes place, there's this very strong norm that you can't use chemical weapons in warfare. So essentially what constructivists would argue is that international organizations, by the adoptions of those norms, have transformed how cooperation and conflict take place. And international organizations are often very key actors in that sense. They strengthen international norms, they bring states and non-state actors together to solve international problems, they foster deliberation, shared understanding, common identities. So for constructivism, it's not just about power politics, it's not just about these institutions that foster free cooperation. Now, constructivists say, listen, international organizations transform the very basis of cooperation in the first place. So here we have three types of theories that try to make sense of international organizations, of patterns within international organizations, or patterns across international organizations. And once again, I'm going to take a minute or so to see whether there are any questions at this point before I move on to the second bit of this talk, which is about the history of international organizations.
We have had a couple of questions coming through. So someone was asking whether constructivists could also be termed as liberals.
I mean, I think that would be a very, very good question. The point here is that the liberal type of theories, the liberal school, spreads out over a number of theories. So some also talk about liberal institutionalists, whereas liberalism is also related to constructivism. And I think this has to do with the fact that within, say, liberal thought, on the one hand, there's a strong emphasis on norms and values, on democracies that don't fight each other, which would squarely fit into the constructivist type of camp. At the same time, liberalism also reminds us of economic cooperation, of multinational enterprises, of free trade, and a lot of that fits in with more institutionalist type of theories. But I think what you're indeed referring to are type of thoughts, the type of norms about improving the world that are very much part of the Constructivist School, yes, indeed.
Great, we've got a couple more come through. Someone has asked, how different is constructivism from institutionalism, and could you give a clear-cut difference?
I mean, I think that's a very good question, because in a sense, institutionalism seems to be a bit stuck in the middle, right, between the power politics that nothing really changes, the type of realist arguments, versus the constructivist arguments that essentially international cooperation is what we make of it. And institutionalism seems to be stuck a bit in the middle there. At the same time, there are very key important differences between what institutionalists think and constructivists think. For institutionalists, they still regard preferences of states as fixed, and they still think that states act primarily through self-interest, that human beings are rational actors that make cost-benefit analysis, that you can calculate outcomes, and so forth. So the world view of a lot of institutionalists is fairly similar to that of realists. The thing where institutionalists and realists differ is in how important indeed the type of FIC operation is. So from that standpoint, constructivists and institutionalists are very different. They're different groups of scholars. They look differently at the world, and constructivism is really a few steps further in considering the transformation of international politics, including through international organizations.
Great. Another question come through. Could you please give an example and further develop what you mean by the flexibility of international organizations in changing circumstances?
I mean, I think that's very good question. So that relates to the institutional design of international organizations,
yeah.
And whether they're flexible or not. Now, one of the examples is often given is trade policy. For instance, countries need to trade with each other, and through international organizations like the World Trade Organization, they reduce trade barriers. But what happens, for instance, if a big economic crisis hits? Are states then temporarily allowed to increase trade barriers again? Or in the case of the Eurozone crisis and the current Corona crisis, are countries allowed to borrow a lot of additional money now temporarily to respond to this challenge? And what you see in a lot of international organizations is that type of flexibility clauses are built in. So in the World Trade Organization, it is allowed in case of a large economic recession to temporarily increase trade barriers. When it comes to the Eurozone and the European Union, it's indeed allowed now temporarily for countries to borrow more money, to spend it domestically on unemployment benefits and all the other things. And so the question here really is, are these type of flexibility mechanisms, are they defined in international treaties? Are they part of the design or not? And the underlying logic is that the moment that international organizations have been created by their designers, it's impossible to foresee all future unintended consequences that might happen. So they put in a bit of flexibility to actually deal with that type of future uncertainty. Now, flexibility can't be unlimited, because if flexibility is unlimited, states will no longer fulfill their obligations and use it just as an excuse to escape international law. Yet, often international organizations need to have some flexibility indeed to survive these type of crises. So it's an important balancing act, and we see quite a bit of variation there between international organizations. I hope that answers the question.
Great. This seems to have brought up a couple more questions as well. So someone has asked, can we say if realism has failed, as nearly all international organizations created since 1945 can we say if realism has failed, as nearly all international organizations that have been created since 1945, where we only saw one, the US, and therefore should we wait for another shift to see whether realism is right or wrong?
Well, I mean, I think realism overall has had a hard time explaining international organizations. It has been very capable of explaining why there's no cooperation, why war breaks out, why international organizations are ineffective and fail. but still, a lot of states have been investing in these international organizations and have chosen multilateral cooperation over other unilateral alternatives. And realism has difficulty explaining that. Now, I think one of the things that we'll come back to a bit in the next section on the history of international organizations is that a lot of realists have also said that, okay, there is all that international cooperation, but essentially it's an extension of US hegemony. I mean, the US has been ruling the world, has been a unipolar moment, and these international organizations are an extension of US influence. It's essentially hegemony. And realists now say, well, listen, with the slow relative decline of the United States and say the increase of emerging powers such as China, international organizations will get in a difficult spot because they have been created to support an American agenda, more or less, and they're now going to have difficulties because there are other countries coming up. So realists in that sense are very much currently predicting the end of liberal international order. They think that international organizations are in major crisis because of that. So I think that is something that realists can explain or can talk about. But overall, I think realists have a tough time explaining what has happened in the last 70 years in terms of international cooperation. So yes, I do think that they have an issue as a theory. What I suggest is, unless there are other pertinent questions, is that we move on to the next section on the history of international organizations, and then we can come back to a number of points once I've done these slides. Would that be okay?
Yep, that's totally fine. There are a few more questions, but we can come back to them.
Okay, so let me click on the slide. There we go. So we're moving now from the theory to the history of international organizations, and there's a bit of a continuity in there. Theories obviously try to explain, the big things on international organizations. A lot of the history is about the nitty-gritty details about what happened in specific years and how international organizations reacted. But historians are also looking for broader patterns among international organizations. So you'll see a lot of interaction between what I've talked about with regard to realism, institutionalism, constructivism, and what we're now going to be seeing with regard to history. So let me just bring back that graph of the number of international organizations since 1800. And I think what historians really like to do is to point at the different type of phases in the development of international organizations. So I think the first real question from a historical point of view is, why are there no international organizations prior to 1815? The Rhine River Commission, which was created as part of the Treaty of Versailles, is typically seen as the first real international organization. So the question is, what was there before the Napoleonic Wars? Why weren't there international organizations, and why do we only see them really appearing during the course of the 19th century? So I think that's an important question from a historical point of view. International organizations have not always been around, so there's something specific about, modern history, about our society since the 19th century that has led to the creation of international organizations. So I think that's an important first step. Historians then also really point at the long 19th century, if you like, and particularly creation of a lot of technical international organizations. So you got the Universal Postal Union, which was created, the Telegraph Union, the Telecommunication Union. I'll get to some of those further. But a lot of these international organizations up till 1914, the First World War, were technical in nature. What was also important was the creation of the Hague Tribunal in 1899. So I think that was really one of the first instances where you got an international court that could arbitrate over differences between states. So if states disagreed on something, a bit of territory or something else, they could go to the Hague Tribunal and get an international ruling. And you see quite a lot of continuity from the Hague Tribunal to the International Court of Justice and all sorts of international arbitration tribunals that we currently have in place. During the interbellum, so after the First World War, before the Second World War, the League system of the League of Nations really was the show in town. So you had the League of Nations, you had the agencies like the International Labour Organization and so forth. But a lot of international cooperation was centered around the League of Nations. What's interesting after the Second World War, as mentioned before, is that short period post 1945 in which you get a lot of US-sponsored international organizations. So you have obviously the United Nations, which was negotiated in San Francisco. You get the international financial institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. The United States also sponsored a lot of regional cooperation in Europe. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the European Economic Community, the Marshall Plan, the Coal and Steel Community. So there's really a lot of American activity in the post-war period, which led to a number of fairly strong international organizations, highly institutionalized organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, that are still with us. What's interesting, though, if we move from the immediate post-45 period towards the middle of the Cold War, is that you see from the 1970s onwards a lot of regional organizations being created. We obviously had European integration in the coal and steel community in Europe, but then certainly we start seeing a lot of regional organizations popping up everywhere across the globe. It starts in the 1970s, and we get a new wave in the 1990s and the 2000s. What's also interesting from the 1980s onwards is that a lot of people are saying, okay, we've had these state-run international organizations like the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, but in this day and age, those type of static state-run organizations are no longer fit for purpose, for solving the environment or other, regulating the internet. So what we see from the 1980s onwards is a lot of what we call innovative forms of global governance, regimes rather than international organizations, private forms of authority coming up, international non-governmental organizations dealing with global governance. So another take on how things work. And I think the environment is really quite a good example of this. And then finally, I talked a bit about that on realism in the previous section. The current crisis of liberal international order, the question whether the whole house of global governance is coming down. We previously had that discussion with the emerging powers, China and so forth, particularly the Trump administration, Brexit in the United Kingdom have really led to that question of are we now seeing the end of the liberal international order as we know it or not. One of the future webinars we're planning will actually be on this this theme, but I think overall what we nicely see is that there have been very different phases in how people thought about international cooperation, how to best organize international cooperation over time. So there's not really one blueprint that has been used that's successful and adopted across history. And we see actually quite a lot of phases and variation there. So let me move to the next slide on the history of international organizations. I should have it now. It's a slight delay, yes. So I think this is, I talked a bit about the general patterns in history, but now I want to talk a bit more about specific policy areas that got subject to cooperation. And I think what we saw very much first in the early 19th century was international commerce coming up. So as a result of the Industrial Revolution, which started in the late 18th century in the United Kingdom and then slowly spread over the rest of Europe, industrialization led to a lot of international commerce. And the Rhine, the river Rhine, which you see on the picture, suddenly became full of all sorts of vessels, shipping goods from the Netherlands at the North Sea, far into Germany and Switzerland and so forth. And this led to international cooperation questions. How do you deal with tariffs on the River Rhine? How do you deal with navigation on the River Rhine? Should these vessels go on the right side or the left side of the river? How fast can they go? What if there are accidents? Who's responsible? And even, is there social policy for these people on those ships? So as a result of increasing international commerce due to industrialization, we see a demand for international regulation and indeed international organizations. And then in 1815, the countries bordering the Rhine set up the Rhine River Commission to actually deal with that. Now, the Rhine River Commission still exists. The picture all the way on the right of the slide is their meeting room. So they still meet, they still talk about these things, and it's an international organization that now exists for 200 years already. And it was the first one, and it's an international organization that fulfills our definition and how we think of international organizations. But international commerce was not the only problem coming on the international agenda, particularly after aftermath of the First World War, there were questions about refugees and migration in Europe. So the League of Nations, after it was established, immediately started focusing as well on questions of refugees and migration. It appointed the High Commissioner for that. Now, the issue of refugees and migration became obviously a lot more serious in the run-up to the Second World War and in the aftermath of the Second World War, when the countries set up an international refugee organization, and it led to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees afterwards. But since 1921, we have focused on the international agenda on refugees. Now, the Second World War and the Holocaust also brought up really the question of human rights. So since 1946, human rights violations are high on the international agenda, and the United Nations deals very extensively with that. We see since the 1970s that environmental problems are increasingly dealt with on the international level. So obviously we're dealing now with climate change in the context of the Paris Agreement, but since the 1970s, member states have worked together through the UN Environmental Programme and other initiatives on the environment. So every time that a problem becomes international or trans-border, you see that countries start cooperating through the context of international organizations. And this is very much what we call the problem condition. It's the first step towards establishing international organizations. There needs to be an international or trans-border problem. Problems were there with international commerce in the 19th century, but some problems came up later, like in the environment, or now, for instance, the internet and cybersecurity. So there needs to be a problem for states to cooperate. But it's also important that states recognize that this problem not only exists, but that it can be addressed through international organizations. And that's what we call the cognitive condition. So for instance, countries recognize that war and international security might be a problem, but they haven't recognized yet how precisely for international organizations we can solve war. We obviously have UN peacekeeping, send peacekeepers across the globe, but we haven't really recognized yet how we're going to solve the problem of war internationally. Some other problems, we have recognized how we can address them. For instance, the gap in the ozone layer, a massive environmental problem we talked a couple of decades ago about, has essentially been addressed through international cooperation. So that it should not just be a problem for international organizations to be established, there should also be an understanding that international organizations can actually help to address that problem. And finally, it's what we call the hegemonic condition. International cooperation tends to be very expensive. So it helps if a big country, a major state, is actually sponsoring international organizations, is picking up the bill for cooperation. And I think this is really where the United States comes back and the support that the United States has given to the post-1945 post-war order. So it's not just that there needs to be a problem, it also needs to be that countries recognize that this problem can be solved for international organizations. And finally, a powerful country needs to pay for it. Now, what we see throughout history is if these three conditions come together, and often they don't come together, but if they come together, we see typically that international organizations are being created to solve those problems. And what I would like to do on on the next slide and final slide on the history of international organization is just give you a sense of all the sorts of international organizations that have been set up to deal with questions of international commerce. So let me see whether I can get to the next slide. There we go. So this is essentially one long table of international organizations that is also available in our book that have been created to deal with commerce problems. So river navigation, for instance, is a nice example, and that led to the Rhine River Commission. But the standardization of transport also required, for instance, an international union for railways, an international maritime committee. And after the Second World War, we got an international civil aviation organization. We had to standardize communication, the Universal Postal Union, International Telegraph Union. We have now ICANN, which is the Internet Corporation for assigned names and numbers. But also we standardized a lot of social regulations, for instance, in health through the International Office of Public Hygiene, which is now the World Health Organization. So overall, you see that international commerce has really acted as a stimulus for the creation of international organizations. The Industrial Revolution that took place from the beginning of the 19th century stimulated the creation of all these international organizations to deal with these type of cross-border commerce questions. So there's a large number of this. And I think the same goes for any of the other policy fields, be it the refugees migration, be it peace and security, environmental questions, human rights, cybersecurity. You will see that the moment that these type of questions become important on the international agenda, countries establish organizations. And I'm here coming to the conclusion of the section on the history of international organizations. And perhaps I could take a couple of questions more before I'm reaching conclusions about the whole webinar on the theory and history of international organizations.
Sure, let me just see what's come in. So there were a few questions going back to the theories that you discussed. So someone asked about critical theories, things like Marxist, feminist and post-colonial theories. Is that something that that is considered, or does that go beyond the level of introductory studies?
I think that's a very good question. In our book, we deal with critical theories, although more briefly than with realism, institutionalism, and constructivism. But I think they're very important questions raised by critical theorists. For instance, whether international organizations are not simply tools for elites, international elites, to gain in terms of distribution. So that they can continue to rule. That's a question asked by critical theorists. Or there are important questions from feminists on whether international organizations actually sufficiently deal with feminist agendas, whether they're male dominated, and so forth. There's also critical green theory, which asks, whether international organizations sufficiently deal with questions of global warming and so forth. So I think overall there are lots of important theories from a critical perspective that really wonder whether international organizations are just a force for good, whether they are doing more harm occasionally than they. So whether they actually do harm in certain circumstances, and that provides us really with some reflection, because I think a baseline in a lot of institutionalist and certainly also constructivist theory is indeed that international organizations foster cooperation, and everybody likes cooperation, right? And I think critical theory really challenges a number of these viewpoints. So in the book itself, we talk about that at greater length. Yeah.
Great. Another one here. Is there a chance that these theoretical schools come together to solve some of the problems the world has faced?
I think that's a very important question, because we like to present them as alternative type of theories, right? So given any instance in international organizations, which theory explains it best? And I think there's a lot to be said about competing theories and alternative perspectives. But one can also wonder whether some theories work better in some places. If you think about the security situation in the Middle East, for instance, you might be more inclined to rely on realist theory. Whereas if you want to explain cooperation in the European Union, you might focus more on institutionalist type of theories, the heavily institutionalized forums that the European Union offers helps us to really understand the idea of thick cooperation. And when you talk about constructivist theories, perhaps the type of norms that the United Nations is promoting really fit nicely with those type of theories. So overall, none of these theories will be able to explain everything in global governance, and in specific fields of international organizations, some theories might be stronger than others. So I think that would be really my way of going about it, thinking which theory works best in which case, but also considering why in some areas some theories simply have less leverage than others.
Great. We have a question here about how international organisations choose their headquarters. Are there any sort of things that they need to consider when thinking about where they'll base themselves?
I think that's a fascinating question, and I think a lot of researchers have only started working on that question. It's a fundamental one. When you read the books about the League of Nations, people were talking about the Geneva atmosphere, about simply a couple of hundred diplomats and civil servants working in Geneva closely together to prevent war and work on questions of peace, and that created a special atmosphere down there. And I think we probably can say that the United Nations, now that it's in New York, is delivering different type of outcomes simply because of the cosmopolitan city where it's based. And we also know instances of international organizations for diplomatic compromise being put in cities where there's no real international airport. And that is not to the benefit of those international organizations. If national officials and diplomats can no longer fly in easily, they probably won't be visiting those international organizations. So the headquarter question really is an important one. And what we see is that lots of headquarters of international organizations are still based in Paris, which really reflects probably world politics from the beginning of the 20th century. And obviously London is dominant as well, but that some of the newer ones are obviously in the United States. So there is a bit of a great power politics explanation for that as well. But if you want a real policy practical advice, do put an international organization in a place that has good international connections, because that seems to be really related to its vitality. Yes.
Great. Okay. There are a few more, but this one seems particularly topical. How do you think the global coronavirus crisis and oncoming global recession will likely shape the global landscape of international organizations in the future?
Well, I mean, I think that's it's looking a bit in a glass ball and making some predictions about the future. But I think what we see, particularly with the World Health Organization, is that it seems a bit of a mixed blessing. On the one hand, this is what the World Health Organization is for, right? It has been created to deal with those type of international crises. It has built up expertise along those lines, and this is for the World Health Organization a massive opportunity to show that it can, make a valuable contribution, support countries, foster international cooperation. I mean, this is really why we have the World Health Organization. At the same time, we also know that all international organizations suffer from a lack of resources, don't have enough funding, don't perhaps have enough expertise. So one also needs to wonder, for instance, with the World Health Organization, whether the expectations of this organization are simply not too high. And if it cannot fulfill those type of expectations, it's going to be under a lot of criticism. Criticism, for instance, that it took Chinese casualty numbers at face value, criticism from the Trump administration that the US is paying too much, criticism from Taiwan, which is not a member, that it can't access its services. So it can go either way. On the one hand, this is really why we have those type of international organizations. On the other hand, there's a real risk for these international organizations to essentially under-deliver on their mandate. So I think the jury very much is out on the World Health Organization. We'll see how that goes. On other international organizations, one needs to wonder what the effect is. Will the Security Council be able to rally around this and say, listen, Corona is a challenge to peace and security? Will the European Union be able to sustain its Eurozone? I think these are all very important questions, and we'll see in the coming months and years whether indeed international cooperation will be strengthened or whether countries will go back to their sovereign selves and try to figure out these problems themselves. So I don't think I have an answer yet to that question, but it's an important one.
Great. Okay. Do you want to go back to your conclusion maybe, and then we can come to the final questions in just a moment?
Yeah, I think that's very good. So the conclusion literally is one slide, if I can get it up. See. So, conclusion. So I think we talked about three things today, a bit about how we can define international organizations, how we can think about it through theories, and also the historical development of international organizations. So in terms of definition, I've provided really a minimal type of definition of international organizations, which requires international organizations to have 3 or more members, regular meetings, and a standing secretariat. Now, many international organizations do a lot more, but this helps us to identify about 500 international organizations. At the same time, it's important within those 500 to distinguish between the apples and the oranges, and I've given one way of doing it by distinguishing between task-specific and general purpose international organizations. There are many other typologies of international organizations, and it's really important to think about, we have 500, but they're not all the same. I've also provided you with 3 theoretical schools of thinking about it. So a realist school that talks really about different organizations, and finally the Constructivist School, which argues that international organizations can transform international cooperation. We've also talked about the history of international organization, particularly different phases through which international organizations have developed since the beginning of the 19th century. And in that sense, I've made the argument that international organizations are often a response to anything on the agenda. And that's really, I think, the final point on the history of international organizations. So I'm happy to take a few more questions at this point. I would also like to point out on the next slide that this was the first webinar on international organizations, and that we have 3 more lined up. If I can just get that slide. In 4 weeks, on the 12th of May, we talk about the activities of international organizations, and then finally on the 26th of May, the future of international organizations, so the current crisis of liberal international order. Now I'm hoping that you can also join for those webinars, and they relate to different parts of the book International Organization, and it will go a bit more into how do international organizations. So it really complements some of the big picture that we presented today. It's 1 o'clock, so I know that some people will have to leave, but I'm happy to take at this point some final questions.
Great. Okay. Well, for anybody that that does have to leave today, I just want to say thank you very much for joining and for asking us all of the questions. There have been loads coming through, and also thank you very much to our host. This has been really interesting, and very much look forward to the forthcoming webinars too. So now if we jump back to the questions, we've had a question, are countries that contribute greatly to the UN funding rewarded for it in some way?
So I think that's a good question, and some excellent academic research is currently being done on the funding of international organizations. Now here the specific case is the UN, and all sorts of international organizations have different rules for their funding. But what you have quite strongly in the UN system is that funding consists of at least two parts. On the one hand, there's the regular funding that every single country needs to pay, and that's based on things like population, size of the economy, GDP. So in many international organizations, there's a key that calculates how much countries need to pay, and there's nothing they can do about it. At a certain moment, they're going to have to pay their annual fees. At the same time, and you see that quite strongly in the United Nations, is that a lot of UN agencies rely on voluntary funding. So, for instance, the United States can say, okay, in addition to what we pay to the UN, we think that the UN Development Program, or to UNICEF, the Children's Fund, or indeed to the World Health Organization. Now, that's obviously where politics comes in, because some of the great powers are more capable of sending substantial chunks of money to the international organizations that they think work best for them. And that certainly will buy them influence, and they can play around with that. Now, if you are the top administrator of one of the World Health Organization these days, and you hear the type of threats that President Trump is making about cutting funding, voluntary funding for the World Health Organization, you'll probably listen and pay careful attention, and try through diplomatic ways to see what precisely the challenges are and what you want to do with that. Funding of international organizations is sized. A lot more emphasis is on voluntary funding that countries provide, and there's certainly a great deal of politics going on there. So thank you for that question.
Okay, next one. Let's see. Is there a differentiation in the book between international organizations with regard to whether states relinquish sovereignty or not to them? Hi, did you hear the question? Oh dear, I think we might have had a slight technical hitch right at the end. But if you had a question that has been unanswered, I will get a written response for you and get back to you.
I'm afraid I can't.
Oh, hello, can you hear us again? No. Okay, well, I think we'll draw the webinar to an end now. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. And as I said, we'll get back to you with any questions.
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, okay, sorry. I'm not quite sure what happened there.
But I suggest that since we're running past 1 o'clock, question.
Yeah, okay, well, we'll wrap things up, and then we can get back to anybody whose question we didn't answer. So thank you very much for joining us today, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Bye-bye.